I believe the title we chose was the Secret of Instant Illumination. Is that correct? Instant Illumination. I didn't say enlightenment, but illumination. Enlightenment has a certain Buddhist baggage of nuances to it that I wanted to leave out and understand this breakthrough of illumination as a universal and natural process that doesn't require any religious or metaphysical concepts. In fact, it's the letting go of all concepts. And of course, it's not really true that illumination is instantaneous, for the simple reason that instant seems to appeal to the reality of time, when we know that there really is no time. But it's instant in a phenomenological sense, in probably a similar sense to if you're looking at an optical illusion and you only see one image in that illusion, and then suddenly, in an instant, you see another one. I'm sure you all know the famous ones. There's the one that's an old woman, but also a young woman. There's the vase that's also the two faces in profile, gazing at each other, right? And many others. But the ego tends to see only one image or one particular type of projection in its dream space, let's say, which was a phenomenon taken advantage by a fellow named Rorschach, who invented a personality test that's used in psychoanalysis quite often, of a set of ink blots, and the client is asked to say what they see in it. And of course, their own unconscious projections tend to be what is seen. But that principle tends to apply generally. So there's an instant when you see, or let's say you recognize, that there is something else in the picture that you never saw before, or you forgot that you saw it, and yet you know you have always seen it because you know that picture. And that picture, of course, is yourself. But there does come an instant in which you recognize the real that might have been hidden because of an unreal projection upon the form. So the reason why we are having a retreat about instant illumination is that we are now in the process of a rolling apocalypse, as I think most people are able to observe. And reality is often, or is at this particular juncture of the culmination of the dream space, it operates on a principle similar to the one in which people use to boil frogs, right? Everyone's familiar with that now. It's somewhat of a cliche, but if the water is heated slow enough, the frogs will think, okay, I can handle this, I'll just keep swimming around in the pot. But once it reaches a point of being extremely hot, the frog no longer has the strength to leap out of the pot, which it could have done easily if it had recognized that it was getting very hot in here, and that if one did not leap out of the matrix, one would be cooked. And so as we approach the end time, things will be getting hotter. And not only in the world at the, let's say, geopolitical level, but in every fractal individual consciousness space. And a time will come when the individual who did not leap out of the ego consciousness will not be able to, will not have the strength to. And at that point, the drive energy, which had been perhaps stagnant in one of the first 2 or 3 assemblage points, will be captured by the lower death drive. You know, the lower and the upper are the same drive, but you can take it in either direction. And if one hasn't used one's time to prepare for the leap into the freedom of the real, then one can fall into a very deep pit of unbearable suffering. Because that is always there. You know, at the base of every ego, I've never seen an exception to it, there is anxiety. I don't think there's such a thing as an ego without anxiety. Is anyone here in that category? And the reason is that what is an ego? It is that, let's say, amount of consciousness from the infinite that congeals around a human body form as its individual operating system. And so there are collapsed qualia waves, there are sanskaras, which are collapsed waves, but that contain memories and attitudes and reactivities that are routine and typical, and triggers of reaction. And the ego's anxiety, because it is identified, consciousness is identified with a very fragile body form. Bodies are impermanent, they're fragile, they have a relatively short shelf life. Whereas consciousness is timeless, eternal, deathless. But consciousness identified with the body always has death anxiety and pain anxiety, fear anxiety of the other, adequacy anxiety, performance anxiety, you name it, right? There are many different varieties, but every ego is infected with anxiety. And when things get very extreme in the living situation of the body, that anxiety can turn easily to paranoia, terror, and the lower death drive, which can result in suicidal thoughts and actions, even murder and suicide, violence, and of course, despair and hopelessness and a sense of the complete loss of meaning and connection and anything worth living for. So if one remains in the ego when these kinds of events begin to arise and become unavoidable, because, the ego's main activity is avoidance and denial, but when a moment comes when you can no longer swim like the frog in your little ego pot, you can't any longer just maintain your ego's petty narrative and its attachments and its projections and its bad objects and good objects and all of the little flora and fauna of the ego's illusory world. When that can no longer be sustained because your world has been invaded by massive anxieties and, we could say, the unveiling and erupting from the subconscious latent shame, guilt, trauma of whatever kind, and a sense of being in the grip of some demonic power. This can happen, does happen. That's why there's an epidemic of suicide and of murder and of violence in the world today, as well as of drug abuse and every other way that the ego attempts to deal with its unbearable condition. So not everyone is yet in such a desperate state, but that doesn't mean you couldn't reach that state in the future, and it can happen suddenly, simply through the body's becoming, let's say, terminally ill, or in an accident where there's mutilation of the body, or there's just total loss of one's ability to function in society for some reason or other, physical, mental, or financial, or whatever else, right? Disasters can happen of every possible sort. And there's no guarantee that one will be able to have a karmic fate that avoids all of that. So it's not that I would wish that on anyone, but the world is coming to an apocalyptic end. And I don't think most people who are in the frog ego are ready to deal with it, and like to pretend everything is normal, nothing's happening, and even use a metaphysical narrative, as if we're already in non-duality and who cares. But that's a facade, and that won't stop the anxiety from erupting if there is still any kind of ego narrative that is still circulating through the mental apparatus. This is not news to anyone here, and probably not, if there are any pragyanis listening or watching, not to any of them. And, it's probably not news to anyone, really, if they were candid about the situation. But that's one of the resistances of the ego to facing the truth of their fragility, our fragility, because it's the nature of flesh. So, as we get to that point where your frog ego doesn't have the strength to make any effort to jump out of the pot, it would be very handy if you had a get out of the pot card, like like one of those get out of jail cards in, is it Monopoly? I forget the game, but and so if you understood that there is such a thing as instant, effortless illumination, and that illumination, if it is established, can become liberation and freedom from the boiling pot. And if you knew that you could do that instantaneously, simply by shifting your perception of this mental optical illusion we call reality, then I think that there would be no hesitation in doing that. But at the moment in which a great deal of eruption of anxiety comes, the coherence to remember that truth may not arise in the mental apparatus. And that's the problem. You can know something intellectually, and it's of no use to you whatsoever in the moment in which it is being tested. So, again, the reason for this retreat being offered now is to allow everyone to come to the recognition of the truth that there is only one infinite, immortal, absolute consciousness, one self. And that one self manifests as the self of every being in the many. The one and the many are not different. But you see, that non-dual logic is very difficult for an ego mind to retain. The ego is in an either-or mental space. And so it cannot imagine that, yes, the consciousness is playing a fleshy character in the matrix, in the holographic dream field, but it is also the self of every being and the intelligence that is designing, sustaining, and annihilating the dream and morphing the potency of consciousness into a new reality. So if you are aware of the entirety of the power of consciousness, and you recognize that that power gives you freedom from all suffering, from all karma. But there has to be the grace of the realization of that truth that brings about the will to realize and sustain that realization, the illumination, the light of God consciousness, until the light washes away all the differentiations made by the mental apparatus and ultimately the thinking tendency, the thinking repertoire of that finite consciousness, so that what had been a tiny particle of consciousness or a bubble in an ocean of consciousness dissolves and becomes or realizes it has always been the ocean as a whole, and there was never any individual, because the bubbles are not real, only the ocean is real. So this retreat is a way to understand and and reprogram the mental apparatus to enable not just an eventual one day I'll use this card to get out of the boiling pot, but a recognition that the will to achieve that freedom exists only now. Now is obviously not a moment in time. Now is eternal. But the ego is in time, and it has no sufficient now in which to be able to achieve that self-realization. So the illusion has to fall away, the illusion of individual existence. And to do that, all of the ego defenses that are resisting that letting go have to be depotentiated. And so this retreat is about how do you go about doing that while there is a margin of opportunity to do it before the tsunami of angst and terrifying events, massive catastrophic events occur within the space of one's living form. And those of other forms to whom one's ego may be attached. And be, let's say, traumatized, to fall into grief that is insupportable, and to fall into a sense of abandonment, and all of the kinds of internal suffering that cannot be dealt with when they have reached a level beyond the strength of the ego to contain. And so we will all be tested, because the only way not to fail that test is to be who you really are, what you really are. And to make that real, not intellectual or theoretical or an article on your future to-do list, but it has to be of immediate, highest priority now if it's going to be attained. Because the sanskara of putting something off to the future becomes the very cause of the resistance to the now. But the ego will always say, well, I'm not ready. There's a little too much jouissance I want to, enjoy before I let go. Or, I'm not ready for the price. Even though when you think about it, your real self is ecstatic and infinitely intelligent, whereas the ego is stupid and anxious and delusional. It's hard to imagine how one could make a coherent choice to remain in the delusional state. And yet, every ego does, for as long as they can. But if you know that sooner or later you will be forced out of your ego, but you don't want to leave the ego that way. It's not the ideal way, because you'll end up in the lower death drive. The ideal way is voluntarily surrender to the God self and be absorbed in the infinite consciousness, not to have to beg or to to grovel or to go through some wrathful bardo interval. But everyone will choose their own destiny. All that can be done is to give the knowledge of the truth and the map, and then each being has a sufficient margin of free will that is actually the margin of consciousness not identified with the body, the part that knows it is soul or spirit or bodiless presence. There is that knowledge. And so when the time comes, will you be able to use that knowledge to leap out of the pot? Or even better, to realize you were never in it in the first place, that you're not a boiled frog or a half-boiled frog, whatever state you might be in, but that you are always already in the freedom of the Absolute Self. But that knowledge has to be made totally real in the heart, the core of the character's consciousness, to be effective. The non-duality of the oneself and the individual fractal has to be realized and completely transformed into that paradoxical unity of the real and the unreal. And how this is done requires a very clear capacity to reason one's way out of the symbolic domain of consciousness, and of course out of the imaginary, but to be able to use all of those powers of coherence and clarity to overcome the illusory beliefs that act as barriers to liberation and that create more karma and therefore more suffering. One of the main problems is the ego is a fictional being. The soul is the creator of that local fiction. The soul itself is a creation of the universal dreamer of the fiction of the cosmic whole. But each one on a fractal level is the designer of their own fictional entity. And there's an attachment to your creation rather than to your creator. And so the ego doesn't want to let go of its unreality that is its own masterwork, even though one may be in an ego that suffers from self-hatred and self-sabotage. There's still an attachment to that. And because the ego is a fictional being, it's attracted to fictions. It wants to divert itself from its own truth and read novels and plays and see movies and engage in gossip and deal with all of the fictional small talk of every other fictional being rather than to realize the real. So it's all of these tendencies that we're going to deconstruct and hopefully become free of in this next retreat. So that's the long answer to the question that people are probably sorry they even told me they wanted to talk about. But that's the nature of the theme of the retreat, and the actual elements of the teachings will come from many spiritual traditions, including modern, postmodern, depth psychological and psychoanalytic and other partial paradigms, as well, of course, as all the non-dual and mystical traditions. But all of them have to be left behind. All of them. Even your most dearest belief system, if you want freedom in the real. And that is the challenge. Because there is no person in the real. But there is blissful consciousness. But the person can't believe it and can't take the risk to find out. Namaste.